Welcome to SharePoint Online End User Beginner. SharePoint is a web-based platform designed to facilitate more effective communication and collaboration on projects, within teams, and through standard day-to-day operations. This class will give you a solid foundation on standard navigation and practices. If you wish to further your training, we offer live public classes, or we can bring a training to you with a private class. Visit learnit.com for more details. Remember to like and subscribe, and let us know your thoughts in the comments.
Hello, and welcome to Microsoft SharePoint Online for end users. My name is Sean Bugler, and today we're going to be talking about all the things you're going to need to know to get started with Microsoft's online communication and collaboration platform, SharePoint. Let's go ahead and get started. In our first section, we'll talk about what is SharePoint. We'll discuss how information is shared. But more importantly than that, we'll talk about some of the current challenges of sharing information, like what can go wrong, or what things involve a lot more work than should be. From there, we'll shift the conversation to understanding SharePoint. Understanding both where it is and how it's saved is kind of important. And finally, we'll talk about how to access content from anywhere on any device. So a lot of really cool stuff to talk about here. Welcome. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. Let's talk about how information is shared. Now, there are a variety of tools at our disposal when it comes to sharing information. So make no mistake that while we'll talk about quite a few, how you and your organization work is entirely dependent on how their infrastructure is set up. So for example, when we talk about sharing information, many, but not all of you, interact with file shares or shared network drives. Now, these come in all different shapes and sizes. Some of you call them the S drive, or the Q drive, or the P drive. But its central focus is an off-computer stored network drive that allows you to upload files and, likewise, download files as long as you're connected to your organization's internal network. How about email? Email is still considered to be one of the predominant ways that we share information, particularly when it comes to sharing files. I've got a Word document or a presentation that I need to share with you. I'm probably going to pull out Outlook, attach a file, and send it on its merry way. How about instant messaging? In the last couple of years, instant messaging within the workplace has seen a renaissance. Whether it's Link, now known as Skype for Business, Slack, Facebook for Work, Microsoft Teams, there are a variety of instant messaging platforms at our disposal. How we use them, of course, varies from workplace to workplace. But nonetheless, it is becoming a quick and easy way to communicate information or ask a quick question if we need to. Voicemail. A classic one, but nonetheless still a critical part of our information sharing infrastructure. When we talk about voicemail, it's generally when we miss somebody as we're trying to call them, and we leave them a brief message indicating either information I need to give them or letting them know that there's information I need to receive. And finally, websites. Now, websites can be referring to public-facing sites like www.bestbuy.com, but it also might be referring to the intranet that we have at many of our workplaces. That internal main page where we can go to get the latest announcements, download the latest files, even upload our latest versions of files as well. Now, regardless of which tools of these you use, the fact of the matter is that there are a lot of different ways to share information. And that can be tough to keep tabs on. Whether you're trying to remember where you first saw that piece of information, or perhaps maybe you're trying to decide which is the best way to communicate with certain people, there are a variety of challenges that present themselves when we talk about something as simple, but nonetheless important, as sharing information. Let's shift the conversation over to challenges when sharing data. We talked about quite a bit of different tools that are available to help share information, but what are some challenges that arise regardless of what tools we use? Well, one of the most popular challenges that we see in the modern workplace is the ability to manage versions. When we talk about managing versions, we talk about making sure that you have access to the latest file, that you can find the latest version of a document and definitively say, this is it. This is the final version, or at a minimum, the last major changes exist within this file. Now, people try to circumvent this challenge in a variety of different ways. For example, they might try to put the date in the name of the file, or they might try to use version numbers in the name of the file, 2.0, 3.0. Edited today, edited tomorrow, final version. Regardless of how you try to use that kind of naming scheme to manage versions, keep in mind that not everybody is going to stay consistent with how they name their files. And more importantly, we tend to be, as a culture and as a people, very subjected to what we call mood-based naming. So if you've ever named a file with a date one day and then said same date 2.0 the next, then you very well may be subjected to mood-based naming. So there's no way to guarantee that you're looking at the latest version of a file, especially when it comes to collaborating with multiple people. So let's say I've got a Word document and I want to share it with both Raj and Jessica to get their notes on what changes could be made. So I email that document because, of course, that's how you would get that file to them, right? I email that document to Raj and Jessica. How many versions of that document are there right now? If you said 2, keep in mind that I still have a copy of it myself. Now, if you say 3, however, keep in mind that both Raj and Jessica, either one could also do what many people do, which is as soon as they receive that file, they save as and create another copy of that file so as not to edit the original. So now there are as many as 5 different versions with 0 edits. Imagine both of them make their changes, send their versions back to me via Outlook. How many versions of that document are there now? Through one round of edits, there can be as many as 10 different versions of a document. To say nothing of the challenges of finding that file in Outlook later, making sure that you have the latest version or that you've unified all changes across all versions into a single document is an incredibly Herculean challenge. How about controlling access? Making sure that only the right people have access to a file. When we talk about file shared network drives, for example, oftentimes that's carte blanche access. If you have access to the internal network, you have access to those shared network drives. Now, of course, IT departments can and usually do restrict access depending on who you are. But keep in mind that they're not necessarily enacting restrictions based on who you are on each individual document. They're often talking about whether or not you do or don't have access to an entire shared network drive as a collective whole. And even then, you as a user don't have total access over who does and doesn't have access, and more importantly, what kind of access they get. Some people should be able to edit, other people should only be able to read. How about managing retention? Making sure that not only do people have access to it when they need it, but that when they don't need it, they cease to have access to it. This is valuable on a variety of different levels, but it often comes to a head when we talk about contractors. People should have access to these files for as long as they work for a company, but when they no longer work for us, they shouldn't have access to these files. But if you've emailed copies of documents to somebody, you can't control whether or not somebody does or does not continue to have access to it. Sure, you can pick up a phone and say, hey, I've decided you don't have access to this file anymore, but all you've really told them is that I don't know how technology works. If you've emailed somebody a document, you have essentially surrendered control of that document. Now, these 3 challenges that we've talked about here are big challenges, but they pale in comparison to what is arguably considered the biggest challenge of our modern time: finding that content later. Finding content is an incredibly large challenge, and it's one we often don't think about because we've dealt with that challenge for so long. But finding content, even something as simple as the example we gave with managing versions, looking for a document that someone emailed me previously. If there's been more than 2 or 3 rounds of edits, I'm going to have to sort and filter through all these different iterations of that document, all these different versions, to make sure that I'm finding the latest one. To say nothing of the fact that if I've chosen to share that file in any other medium, like shared network drives, in addition to email, that the challenge becomes an even greater one. So these are all major challenges when sharing data. Managing versions, making sure that only the appropriate people have access, and more specifically, what kind of access they do get. Making sure that people cease to have access when they no longer need it, and more importantly than all of those, the ability to find that content. All the access in the world doesn't do you any good if I can't find it to access it. Now, all of these challenges, while challenges, yes, can be managed with what you say? SharePoint. SharePoint supersedes all of these challenges with just some very simple implementation. So in these videos, we'll talk about how these tools work to help eliminate those challenges when it comes to sharing data. So what is SharePoint? Well, I'll tell you right out of the gate what SharePoint isn't. SharePoint is not a single application or even a collection of applications. So when you think about collection of applications, like the Microsoft Office Productivity Suite, SharePoint isn't like that. It's also not like just Word or Excel. If you open up your Start menu, you're not going to find SharePoint installed on your computer. What SharePoint is a web-based platform, a platform on which we can build and create websites. It provides tools and services to help us manage and share information in effective ways. And perhaps most importantly, it helps to provide a collaborative online environment where everybody can go to add and retrieve information. So there are some common questions that come along with what is SharePoint. Perhaps one of the most popular is, if it's not a single application or even collection of applications, where is it installed? SharePoint is installed on a server. Now, if you're using SharePoint online, oftentimes that means that it's installed on a server that's being managed and maintained by Microsoft. How do you upload content? Well, if you've used the internet in any capacity, you're already familiar with, to some degree, how do you upload files to the web? But that said, SharePoint does have specific ways to add content to it. In particular, there are two different components that we'll dive into in a little bit: lists and libraries. You can upload files into libraries. You can also save files directly to SharePoint using some popular Office applications like Word, Excel, and PowerPoint to save directly into those libraries. You can also insert content directly into SharePoint using a variety of what we call lists. Where does the data live? Well, in addition to being installed on a server, the data itself also on that server is stored in what we call an SQL format, or SQL Server. Microsoft maintains the SQL Server database to store all the data that lives inside SharePoint. And finally, how do I access the data? You can access the data by interfacing with what we call web pages. Web pages are the visible part of SharePoint. So we access these web pages via a web browser. And from there, we can view all the data stored in SharePoint utilizing components known as app parts and web parts. Both things we'll be talking about in just a little bit. As we get further and further into these videos, you'll notice that there are these common hallmarks, these common centerpieces of SharePoint that everything kind of coalesces around. We call them the pillars. These pillars are the center points through which we drive all of our SharePoint knowledge. It's how we build our sites. It's the mentality that we hold on to as we use SharePoint. And it helps us to kind of define what makes SharePoint valuable. So the first SharePoint pillar are sites. This is where all the data is stored, and it's the first thing a user sees when they access a SharePoint site. Now, as we get further into sites, you'll notice that sites alone don't drive SharePoint. Instead, what really drives a good SharePoint site is its communities, the communities that feed into a SharePoint site. Now, keep in mind that both of these tie into each other. You've got to have a good site in order to get a community to build around it. And likewise, you need a good community to feed into these sites to make sure that there is useful information. Now, that information we're talking about is, in fact, the third pillar of SharePoint: content. Now, if you've ever seen that movie, Field of Dreams, with Kevin Costner, even if you've never seen the movie, there's a quote that comes out of it that many people know: "If you build it, they will come." Unfortunately, that's only half the story. Because while you can build a site, that's not going to guarantee a community builds around it. It has to have valuable content. And more importantly than having valuable content out of the gate, it has to be easy enough to use so that communities can contribute more content, which in turn drives even more community usage. So you can see how each of these pillars is feeding into the other. You need all of these pillars in order to effectively utilize SharePoint. The fourth pillar that we'll talk about here is search. The ability to find that content is just as valuable as having that content in the first place. We talked about this a little bit earlier with regards to the challenges of sharing data. So to bring it on home, you'll have a site. That site will either have content out of the gate or will have to be built in such a way that contributing content is easy. Regardless of how that content gets there, however, communities will start to build around it, either because it'll be easy for them and beneficial for them to contribute that content, or through search, will be easy to find that content in sites. So these are the core SharePoint pillars that we kind of focus our attention towards as we're building and, more importantly, using our SharePoint sites. One of the cool things about SharePoint as a general rule is that it can be anything to anyone. So regardless of whether or not this is for an entire organization or for a specific project or even for just an individual, SharePoint can be used because of that scalable property we talked about in earlier videos to ebb and flow, expand and contract based on that particular situation's needs. But there are some common SharePoint scenarios, common ways in which these teams, projects, and individuals use SharePoint. So we'd like to talk about a couple of those here, if for no other reason than to give you some perspective on how your organization or project might use SharePoint. One of the most popular ways that we see SharePoint utilized is as a document collaboration tool. This enables us to help share files centrally, securely, and efficiently. This also allows us to help control the editing and, perhaps more importantly, the visibility of any given information. So this harkens back to some of the bigger challenges we talked about in a past video with regards to sharing data. This allows us to ensure that not only do people have the appropriate access, but that we don't just give carte blanche access to say, if you can see the file, you can edit it. I might be able to say, actually, I only want this handful of people to be able to edit, and the other handful to be able to just view the document. But again, it's all about bringing people into a centralized location. Now, it's important to note that it says document collaboration, not document storage. Too often we see SharePoint utilized as just a file dumping ground, but that doesn't have to be what it's all about. In these videos, we'll talk about how to utilize document storage in a way that fosters collaboration as opposed to just shoving it somewhere. Another common SharePoint scenario is as a time and task management tool. Many of you might be familiar with the Microsoft Project Management tool, MS Project. Believe it or not, SharePoint actually has some of its roots in Microsoft Project. If you're familiar with MS Project Server, Microsoft Project Server is foundationally based in SharePoint. The ability to assign tasks, maintain shared calendars and contacts lists for teams. It also allows us to host discussions and gather feedback through surveys. So there are a ton of different ways that we can utilize SharePoint to manage our time, to manage our tasks, particularly within projects. And finally, another common SharePoint scenario, serving as an information portal. This allows us to maintain a central location for storing, searching, and accessing appropriate information. It also allows us to, as a team, provide up-to-date information with focused intent. So all of these are common SharePoint scenarios, ways that we've seen SharePoint utilized. This is by no means the authority on the only ways you can use it, but there are a ton of tools available that feed into these particular use cases, and it very well may be that your team, your organization, or you yourself might find value in any number of different ways that SharePoint can be used. So how do you access a SharePoint site? Well, right out of the gate, you're gonna need a URL. Like any website, a SharePoint site has a URL or web address associated with the site. Generally, this will be emailed to you once you've been given access to a SharePoint site, but other times it might be something that you'll click on in an intranet site. From there, you'll need some form of web client. You can interface with SharePoint using a web browser like Google Chrome or Internet Explorer, but you can also access it increasingly using your tablet or smartphone. Other clients can interact with SharePoint as well, including Microsoft Office applications specifically. So Word and Excel and PowerPoint can actually upload files directly into SharePoint. So that's another common way of accessing SharePoint content. And finally, increasingly, we're seeing that users are being given the ability to access content offline using OneDrive. With OneDrive, users can take content offline where it can be viewed and edited and then synchronized back online with SharePoint. Working offline can be done with our computers, like laptops, but they can also increasingly, with the appropriate apps, be done on both tablets and smartphones. We'll talk a little bit about those apps in just a little bit. But these are how you'll need to access SharePoint, and in some ways, how you can access SharePoint sites. A quick note about offline, not all organizations will enable you to download offline content. Keep in mind that that is a setting, so you may not have access to that particular tool. If you've used SharePoint in previous years, you've probably been aware that SharePoint hasn't been the most mobile-friendly. But increasingly, particularly with the advent of SharePoint Online, we're seeing that we're increasingly being given the ability to access not just any content anywhere, but on any device. Now, of course, this can vary from organization to organization, dependent on your security settings. But one of the things you should note that as of 2016, Microsoft now provides a SharePoint mobile app available for download in the iOS App Store or in the Google Play Store for Android devices. The mobile app allows you to access to a limited degree. Admittedly, it's not full-featured just yet, but to a limited degree allows you to add content to lists, access existing files that have been stored in libraries, and, depending on what other apps you may have installed on your device, you can even edit Word documents, Excel spreadsheets, PowerPoint presentations, add files, delete them, check their versions, even check them out completely. So the SharePoint mobile app is increasingly giving us the ability to do what was limited to just the desktop just a few years ago, is now able to be accessed from our mobile phones and our tablets. We're also seeing improved integration using the OneDrive app, which is available for all tablets, iPhone, iPad, Android. The OneDrive app integration allows us to access, upload, and save offline copies of files stored in SharePoint for our own personal use or for the ability to be able to edit on the go. So regardless of where you're accessing your content, the fact of the matter is that we're no longer limited to just our desktops or just our laptops. We're increasingly seeing the ability to access this content from the devices that are most commonly on our person, our smartphones, our tablets. Pretty cool. Welcome to Module 2, Understanding SharePoint Sites. In this particular section, we'll be talking about a couple of core points in order to truly understand what SharePoints are and what their hierarchy can be like. So we're going to start by talking about SharePoint Online, this class, versus on-premise, which is something that your organization may have previously utilized. We'll examine both the local and global hierarchy of a SharePoint environment. We'll talk about some core navigational elements that are being made available no matter the site you're on. We'll talk about some core site elements that are also being made available. And to a certain degree, we'll talk about the ribbon interface, what it is, and where it is no longer available. And finally, we'll begin a conversation about site permissions. This will by no means be the end-all be-all of site permissions, but it'll give you a quick introduction to what site permissions are and how they impact the experience of SharePoint. Let's go ahead and get started. One of the first things we want to talk about here in this particular module is SharePoint Online versus on-premises. Now, if your organization has used SharePoint in any capacity over the last couple of years, you probably already have some working knowledge of what SharePoint on-premises means. But nonetheless, we'd like to talk about some of the differences between the two so that you know what you're up against as you roll out SharePoint Online. So let's talk about SharePoint Online first. SharePoint Online generally means that SharePoint is hosting your SharePoint implementation on their servers. So that means that you generally have access to a rapid connection that's accessible all over the globe. That also means that updates are managed by Microsoft, although that is subject to your organization's internal policies. Your organization does have the ability to pick and choose when updates are rolled out. Now, as a virtue of the fact that Microsoft is managing this content on their servers, this also enables mobile and external access, something that we didn't traditionally see as an option on on-premises installations. This brings us to SharePoint on-premises. Now, SharePoint on-premises is one of the more traditional ways that SharePoint has been implemented within an organization. This generally means that content was hosted locally on a company-managed server. That also meant that any updates that were or were not applied are managed by your company as well. Access was generally limited to just on-site or through VPN access. So you had to either be physically connected to the network or you had to be VPN'd in order to access content in a SharePoint environment. This limited the impact of SharePoint when you were off-site, working from home, or just on the go. So these are the core differences between SharePoint that we'll see here today. SharePoint Online versus on-premise. And while the interfaces will largely be the same, the benefits we've just enumerated are their key distinctions between the two. Now, in order to work with SharePoint effectively, it's important to know all the different components and what role they play in a SharePoint implementation. So we'll talk about a few of these core components here in this video. The first component we'll talk about here is the site. Now, you might recognize the site as being one of the SharePoint pillars as well. And if you'll remember from that description, a site is just a platform, a foundation on which content can exist. In the terms of a SharePoint component, a site is a collection of customizable, interrelated web pages used to display stored content. So a site is just a portfolio of pages related to a specific subject. You'll notice I also said displays stored content. Neither sites nor pages actually hold data, they just display it. So this of course leads us to our second component of SharePoint, web pages. Web pages display stored content and organizationally relevant data. Pages are generally designed with layouts that are composed of web parts and app parts, which we'll talk about in just a moment. So once again, web pages display stored content, don't actually hold data. So if neither sites nor pages hold data, what does? Well, that brings us to one of two data-driven components in SharePoint. The first is the list component. Lists are just a group of related items or records that happen to share similar data. If you've ever seen a list, they're usually flat in structure, similar to a spreadsheet, with column headers identifying the types of data stored within the list. We'll talk about some types of lists in just a little bit. Now, lists are one of the two components that actually hold data. Lists hold that data directly. The second component is the other way in which we manage data, libraries. So libraries can be similar in structure to a list, complete with column headers. But as opposed to lists which hold the data directly, libraries hold files that hold data. So one more time, lists hold data directly, and they generally receive their information directly from the user through SharePoint. Libraries, on the other hand, hold files that hold data. So the key distinction here might very well be, on one side, I've got a list of names. And on the other side of things, I've got that same list of names, this time, however, stored inside of a Word document. This is the fundamental difference between lists and libraries. If I have this information and I want to store it in SharePoint, it would go into a list. But I have a file here that has that information already and I just want to upload it, it would go into a library. Same information, but one having the container dictates whether or not it would go into a list or into a library. The fifth core component is a web part. This provides powerful functionality for accessing data both inside and, key on the web part here, outside of a SharePoint site. So web parts allow us to access content both within a SharePoint environment or outside in the web. Now, as of SharePoint 2010, this was the end of the list. But in 2013, Microsoft introduced a sixth SharePoint component, the app part. The app part provides a customized access and viewpoint to content that is stored specifically within just lists and libraries. So both web parts and app parts are the components that we use to display data on a web page. Web parts are able to pull within a SharePoint site and outside of it in the greater web. App parts can only pull data from within a SharePoint site, in particular lists and libraries. We'll talk about these in greater detail as we start to work within SharePoint, but these are the 6 core components of SharePoint. And you'll need to know these in order to gain a greater insight into what can and can't be done, both with your data and with your SharePoint site. Now, at least that we've introduced the components in a SharePoint site, it's time to start drawing a bit of a "you are here" map of where all those different components fit into the site's hierarchy. So right out of the gate, each individual organization is going to have a top-level site, the highest that there can be. So this is generally considered to be that root-level site. So if you go to www.companyname.com, that's generally considered a top-level site, meaning that there's nothing above it. Now, a top-level site contains all the same lists and libraries and pages that you've come to expect from a SharePoint site. But that said, top-level sites can have their own subsites, which have their own collections of web pages, lists, and libraries, and of course, web parts and app parts. So it's important to keep in mind here that all sites are self-contained boxes of their own data. So each site has, again, their own pages, their own lists, their own libraries, and likewise their own web parts and app parts. And likewise, those sites can then have their own subsites, which then, again, have their own web pages, their own lists, their own libraries, web parts, and app parts. So each site is a self-contained example of a site, meaning that users can spend their entire careers in one particular part of a site and never know that there was anything above it, to the left or to the right, even below it, for that matter. So it's important to keep in mind that those 6 core components that we've talked about exist within each separate site. Now, that said, all of this that we're talking about is contained within what's called a site collection. So a site collection has its own top-level site, which then has its own subsites, which then may have their own subsites within that. That having been said, organizations aren't necessarily limited to just one site collection. They can have multiple site collections. And in fact, we see this in a very common example with organizations who'd like to give each department their own site collection with their own respective top-level sites. Now, of course, organizations might very well say, well, we don't need multiple site collections. We'll just give each organization their own subsite. There's not a right or a wrong way to do that. It's simply a matter of this is how SharePoint can be implemented. So keep in mind the next time you're inside your SharePoint site, you could very well be in your own site collection, either as a department or as a project or as a team. So to recap, when it comes to the site's hierarchy, each site is self-contained. They have their own pages, their own lists, their own libraries, their own web parts, their own app parts, and they can even have their own subsites, which then in turn have their own SharePoint components. So at this stage here, we've talked about the core SharePoint pillars. What drives a good, well-designed SharePoint site? We've also talked about the core components of SharePoint. What are the different pieces that make up a SharePoint implementation? Now, what we'd like to do is drill in a little bit deeper into the given elements of a site. Things that exist on every site, no matter where you work, no matter an organization's implementation. What is it that makes SharePoint SharePoint? So right out of the gate, we're going to talk about some basic elements. There are 3 basic elements that come with every SharePoint site: a homepage, welcome links, and a search box. So what we're going to do here is I'm actually going to take you through those core 3 elements. So here we are on a new site built specifically for this class. What we're currently on, having just gone directly to this site, this is the home page. It'll generally be indicated with the URL ending in home.aspx, although it should be noted that that can be changed. The home page is simply when you visit a SharePoint site's URL, where's the first page it takes you to? Now, with this newly created site, we've been provided what are called welcome links, or getting started. These tiles that are being made available here are to help us get started with what we can do in a SharePoint environment. You'll notice I've got 6 different tiles here. Depending on your organization's implementation, you may have as few as 3. But keep in mind that what tiles we see are presented based on the permissions you're being given. So I'm a site owner, and I manage every single aspect of this site. So I see as many tiles as there can be. But if you're somebody who only has read access, you very well might only have share your site, for example. So again, the more tiles you see will depend on what permissions you're being given in a particular site. Now, you're not always going to see the getting started links. As you'll see here, it's very easy to click on the link that says remove this. In the event that you do remove it, it's important to note that you can always get it back by clicking on the gear here in the top right corner and selecting Getting Started down at the very bottom. This will take you to an entirely separate page that has, you guessed it, those very same Getting Started links. And finally, the third basic element that you're provided on any site is a search box, which can often be found in the top right corner of any SharePoint site. It's important to note that if an organization has customized any part of SharePoint, this can be moved around a little bit, but generally, you'll find it in the top right portion of any given site. So these are the basic elements of a site. The next collection of elements we'll talk about here that are given elements of any site are the navigational elements. There are 4 core navigational elements that are available in any site: the top links bar, the quick launch bar, the navigation bar, and the breadcrumb trail. All 4 are available from day 1 with any given site. So, here we are back on the same example site. The top links bar can be found at the top portion of the screen here. You'll notice, of course, that mine only has 1 link, but generally what you'll see is, depending on the site you're in, the top links bar will generally point you to other sites. Generally, and it's important to keep in mind, once again, that an organization can deviate from these rules, but the top links bar is generally a jumping off point through which to get to either other different topical sites or to take you to places that are outside of SharePoint. So this is the top links bar. On the left, we have the quick launch bar. The quick launch bar is generally for links that allow us to navigate within a particular site. In this example, I'm on a site called Project Central. So you'll notice that all the links on the left-hand side are related to Project Central. So at this stage here, we've talked about the top links bar being for either other SharePoint sites or outside of SharePoint altogether. And we've talked about the quick launch bar being for more local navigation within one particular site. Now, above all of that is our SharePoint navigation bar. Our SharePoint navigation bar will give us access to, if they're available, our ribbon tools. It'll also give us access to our share, follow, and edit buttons. It's also where we can go, if we have Office 365, to access external Office 365 content, like mail or contacts. But on the far right-hand side, perhaps the most valuable tools of all, the ability to manage our own personal profiles, which has nothing to do with this particular SharePoint site and everything to do with our presence on SharePoint. The help tool, the notifications tool, and most importantly, the site navigation gear. This is perhaps the most important button in all of SharePoint, because it's here that we can go to access our site contents and our site settings. Of course, you'll see here there are many options available that aren't site contents or site settings. But no matter what site you're in, site settings and site contents are 2 of the most valuable links at your disposal as a SharePoint user. So keep in mind that both of those can be found from the gear. So that's the navigation bar. The fourth and final element with regards to navigation is the breadcrumb trail. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into the Central Documents Library. And in particular, I'll go ahead and jump into an existing folder. We'll call this the Important folder. This is a breadcrumb trail, indicating where I am, and more importantly, where I came from. The breadcrumb trail allows you to see how far down the rabbit hole you've gotten. So you'll notice that as I go within another layer of folders, the breadcrumb trail simply grows, again giving me some key indication as to where I've ended up and how I got here. So the breadcrumb trail is an incredibly useful part of the SharePoint design, and it's the fourth key navigational element of a SharePoint site. So we've talked about basic elements of a site, navigational elements of a site. The third and final collection of elements that we'd like to talk about here are the content elements of a site. We've actually already introduced them to you, but we're going to highlight them in a bit more detail now. So content elements are things that are guaranteed to be when it comes to managing the content of a SharePoint site. So to bring us back to the site we were in just a moment ago, here we go, Project Central. By clicking on the gear in the top right-hand corner, you'll reveal all three, or almost all three rather, of the content elements that are available. The first is Site Contents. Site Contents is where you will go to access all of the structure and data available in a particular site. Now remember, each site is a self-contained instance, meaning it has its own lists, its own libraries, its own pages. And we see all of that here in Site Contents. So you'll see all the libraries that I have available in my particular site. You'll see all the lists that I have available, any apps that are available. You'll also see any subsites that are foundationally based or derived from this particular site. So remember, sites can also have their own subsites, which then themselves have their own lists, their own libraries. So here in Site Contents for Project Central, I'm only seeing lists and libraries and other data components of this particular site. I'm not seeing anything related to my child sites down below. So this is Site Contents, and it's a critical part of SharePoint navigation because not all SharePoint sites are designed equally. That said, design can often be something that is left wanting in a SharePoint implementation. Being able to step behind the scenes, away from anything that's user customizable, so that you can go directly to a specific library or to a specific list, is really valuable. The second content element we'd like to talk about can also be found here through Site Contents. The recycle bin. Now there are two different ways to access the recycle bin. The first is here in Site Contents in the top right-hand corner. The second way to access the recycle bin can actually be found no matter where you are, using the quick launch on the left-hand side. You'll notice a quick link to the recycle bin. No matter which one you click on, it'll take you to the same place. So the recycle bin is another really powerful element of our content management here in SharePoint. The third and final content element we'd like to talk about here can once again be found in the gear here in the top right-hand corner. We've already seen that you can get into Site Contents from the gear. We'd like to go ahead and take you now into Site Settings. So Site Settings is where we go to manage the features and options of a given site. Now keep in mind that the amount of links that I see here is dictated based on the permissions that I have. Microsoft, who makes SharePoint, is a big believer in if you can see it, you can do it. If you see a link here on my screen that you don't see in your SharePoint site settings, it's often because you don't have permission to use that setting, whatever it may be. But again, the site settings we're seeing here is for this specific site. So if I were to go to Project Red, or blue or green for that matter, the site settings that I would see there would be for those site settings, not for all sites, just that particular one. So these are the three core content elements. We've talked about Site Contents, which contains all the data and structure for a specific site. We talked about the recycle bin, which can be found either in the top right corner of Site Contents or from the quick launch on the left-hand side of the screen. Same link, different places to find it. And finally, we talked about Site Settings, which I showed you can access from the gear, But I would be remiss if I didn't also show you can access the same site settings right next to the recycle bin, here in the top right corner. So these are the core elements of a site, the basic elements. The homepage, the welcome links, the search box, the navigational elements, whether it was the top links bar, the quick launch bar, the navigation bar, or the breadcrumb trail, and finally, the content elements, all site contents, recycle bin, and site settings. You need all of these, and they're given to you with every site you interact with. You just got to know where to look. With all this talk about structure and content and data and settings and options here in SharePoint, it's easy to forget that all of it is held together with permissioning. Permissioning is the foundational basis on our ability to even access a SharePoint site. So that said, it's time to take a quick look and introduce you to what SharePoint permissions are all about. In order to bring this onto the table, we're going to bring back that hierarchy chart we saw just a moment ago. You might remember this, the top level site, which has its own pages, lists and libraries, web parts and app parts, and of course within that, its own dedicated sites within that site that contain themselves, again, pages, lists, libraries, the whole thing. But what we didn't talk about, that we're going to talk about now, is that all of this is held together using permissions. Permissions in SharePoint exist at every single level in a SharePoint site. So from the top level all the way down to subsites within a site, they all have their own permissions, or more importantly, can have their own permissions. So let's say for the sake of argument here, I've made you an administrator of the top level site. Well, by default, all sites that are underneath this site inherit those permissions. So of course, if you were an owner here, that means you're an owner for all three of these. And likewise for any sites that are beneath those, and so on and so forth. But that said, let's say that you want to make somebody an owner of this site, but not of this one. Well, then this structure doesn't work because, of course, as we've mentioned, anyone who's an owner here is an owner from here and vice versa. So what we can do, and in fact what does happen with a lot of organizations, is they'll do what's called the breaking of inheritancy. The ability for a site to say, hey, I know you said that this person was an owner, but we need other people to be owners. Or likewise, we want people to access this site that should never even know that this site exists, or that site for that matter. So that's a quick glance at what permissionings can be on a site level. They can be different. The default, however, is to look up. If the site above says it's okay, then we say it's okay. But permissions exist at far more than just the site level. Permissions also exist at the list and library level, meaning that within a given site, I can say, hey, you have access to this entire site, but there's one particular library, one particular collection of files that I don't want you to have access to. We do have the ability to manage on a granular list and library level who does and doesn't have access. Now it's important to note that lists and libraries, just like subsites for example, inherit their permissions from the site that they are contained within. So if I create a new list or create a new library, its default is to look at the site that it's in to determine who's going to be an owner, who can edit files inside of a list or a library, who can read only, for that matter. So again, permissions exist at each and every level, but we can go even further. We've mentioned that libraries hold files, as opposed to lists that hold data directly. Well, I might have files in this library that I don't want anybody to be able to edit. I want them to be able to edit all the other files, just not that one file in this library. We have the ability to go even further within the library and say individual files have their own permissions. So to recap, permissions exist at every level. The top level site, individual subsites, individual lists and libraries within a site, even down to single files within one particular library. Now, if there's anything you're going to remember about permissions, let it be that the default is to look up. Whether it's a site looking to its top level site, whether it's a sub-site looking to the site above it, whether it's lists and libraries looking to the site that they're contained within, permissions are all about trickling down.
Thanks for watching. Don't forget we also offer live classes in Office applications, professional development, and private training. Visit learnit.com for more details. Please remember to like and subscribe and let us know your thoughts in the comments. Thank you for choosing Learnit.